Okay, so now that we've seen how the first three sets of market failures work and why they're inefficient, we can now consider how the accumulation of market power can lead to a market failure where the promise of efficiency from free markets is going to be threatened and likely denied. So I think that this video in particular and the one that follows are especially important because is a strongly held belief of mine that when economics and capitalism get a bad rap, as they often do for being heartless, for leading to inequality, for alienating people from their labor and from each other, from leading to a culture of commodification and consumerism, that a lot of these critiques aren't really in response to economics or to capitalism, but are in response to market power. And that sometimes market power can be good, it can be needed when, for example, the government provides us with safe drinking water. However, sometimes it can be really the source of all evils of capitalism and what I like to call the real villain behind the curtain. So also, I think you need to know this material so that you can be aware of market power in whatever industry you end up working, and be aware that if there is market power in those industries, then the prices which you are seeing are likely distorted, and to be able to understand what the maybe true prices should be or what direction of the distortion is going. So lastly, I really don't want you to leave this class with a sense of economism, of everything in the world is free markets all the time, supply and demand are never wrong. Clearly, that only applies when there's perfect competition, and when there's not, as we're going to see in this video, then you're going to understand that free markets are not always going to be able to promise or make good on their promise of efficiency. So as usual with these market failures, I think it's helpful to start off with a definition. And Monopoly is not just a board game with rich Uncle Moneybags over here. It is a situation in which there's one provider of a good or service which faces the entire demand curve and for which there are no alternatives. So if you want to buy a new router, there's only one router provider in town. They have a monopoly on routers. So as we indicated, market failures are going to exist when there are failures of supply and demand to achieve a optimal outcome. And we know that supply and demand are going to achieve the optimal outcome when there's perfect competition. So market failures must mean that we don't have perfect competition in some way. Monopolies are a good example of this because they pretty much violate all of the conditions of perfect competition, which we had previously considered. When there's only one seller of a good, then clearly there are not many buyers and sellers. That when there is a monopolist, that means there's only one provider, which means that other providers who could see how good it is to be the monopolist can't become the monopolist. They can't enter that industry. And so there are also barriers to entry. So the second assumption isn't met. And lastly, there are also advantages to be the monopolist for the existing firm, and that's why they want to continue to be a monopolist and not leave that industry. So the third assumption isn't met either. The fourth assumption is likely met, but importantly here, when there is not full information on pricing, then we're likely to create a situation where there can be market power when there are multiple providers of goods and services. So 4 is not an outcome of market power, but it can lead to market power. So in the United States, we have a long history with monopolies. Some of the largest companies of the late 19th, early 20th century, as well as throughout the 20th century, have been monopolies, or now at least near monopolies. That the sole provider of oil in the US and of steel were some of the most famous monopolies throughout our national history. That today Amazon, if they're not a monopoly in some industries, they're at least really close. They, at one point in time, wanted to be the sole provider, wanted to have monopoly power over online diaper sales. And so there was another website with a really generic name, which I can't remember right now, which was the provider. They were going to be a competitor. They were also going to provide online diaper sales. And Amazon, as a way to drive them out of the business, was able to use the profits from other parts of their company to drop the price on diapers below the marginal cost it made to produce them, so they could take a loss in the near term as a way to starve the other company out of online diaper sales. And so that was a way that Amazon could use their market power in some industries to give them market power in another industry. Public utilities are an example in the other direction, that they are monopolies, but we typically think of them using their market power beneficially, that they're able to create efficiencies by not having competition over provision of drinking water. We don't have 6 different drinking water lines going through town, which may crack at any point in time because there's competition to provide us with the water. There's only one provider. It's our local Department of Public Utilities, and they're able to save costs of infrastructure by only needing one set of infrastructure to be able to provide all of us with our water. So additionally, we have other companies which are probably near monopolies, which don't have total dominance of an industry, but are at least pretty close. And these are, we can think of as being duopolies or oligopolies. We're not going to go over them in this class. You may in higher level classes. But if you can understand how monopolies work, then you can understand how oligopolies and duopolies work. They're basically, the lessons are similar. There's just more than one provider, but not many buyers or sellers. So thinking back to the list of historical examples of monopolists and near monopolists, while we've said that they are bad and inefficient so far, clearly many of us get everyday enjoyment out of these companies and out of their existence. So what benefits may they provide us as consumers? Well, the first is probably low costs, that by there not being a sense of competition and the monopolists being able to charge whatever price they want, they may be able to pass on some of those savings to us as consumers, and likely they probably do in some situations. Walmart may have a monopoly on some goods, and they're able to pass on cheaper prices to the rest of us. By not needing to compete with other companies and being able to charge whatever price, not whatever price they want, but be able to be less constrained by the pricing from traditional markets, monopolists then could, instead of lowering the cost of their products, reinvest some of those savings into research and development and create new products. And certainly we all benefit from new products, which Amazon, Facebook, or Google, or these other large monopolist companies are able to produce. And perhaps most importantly, we have reduced search costs, that I don't have to spend, though it feels, as I'm sure it does for all of you, that I spend too much time shopping online as is. I don't have to go to a different website to get clothes, some sorts of food products, books, or technological equipment. I can go to the same source, which saves me time and benefits me in that way. So if there are benefits to being a monopolist, if you're less constrained by markets and you're able to have more autonomy, more freedom over what price you charge, and if they do impart some benefits to the rest of us as consumers, why don't we see more of them? So first of all, it can be hard to create in a free market economy. You need some combination of luck, of being able to drive other people out of the market, which is going to take already economies of scale and high costs. or you're going to need help of the government regulation. And typically, when we see monopolies in existence, they are generally against the public good. And so the government works the other way. We use the government to regulate these monopolies, and we will indicate how we do so later in this video. So what I'd like to do now, before discussing how we would regulate monopolies, is to show, using a supply and demand graph, how we know that a rational, profit-maximizing monopoly is going to be inefficient and is going to come at a cost to the rest of us in society. So first, we'll draw a supply curve which captures the marginal cost of production. That's not going to be different for this monopolist. And we're going to draw a demand curve which is going to capture, remember, the marginal benefit to consumers as well as the willingness to pay for the product. And lastly, we're going to draw a new curve here, which is going to be the marginal revenue curve. And so this is going to be different for the monopolist and is in a perfectly competitive industry. In a perfectly competitive industry, the marginal revenue is going to largely equal the price. That if we think of revenue as basically income to a producer, as money that they receive in return for supplying one more good on the market, then in a perfectly competitive industry, if you're able to sell one more bottle of shampoo, then the marginal revenue you get from that bottle is equal to the price. You get $8, $5, whatever. And that's going to be the same no matter how many bottles of shampoo you sell. Since the monopolist is going to face the entire demand curve, they have the ability to restrict their output, and they can change the price. They can discriminate and change the price that they charge to different consumers by restricting the output. So let's take a look. For the very first incremental unit of a good that they sell, for the marginal unit of consumption, then the demand which they are facing has a high willingness to pay. However, if they were to try to set that price at that high willingness to pay, then they could only sell that first marginal one unit. If they tried to sell, that graph isn't ideal there. If they tried to sell 4 units, then for all of these units here, the price would be higher than the demand curve, and the marginal cost that consumers would face from buying more of that good, which would be given to them by the price, would be higher than the marginal benefit that they would receive from buying it. So if monopolists want to increase their quantity, then they have to decrease their price. And they're going to make their decision of how much to produce based off of where their marginal cost of production is equal to their marginal revenue of production. So they're going to then produce this amount, which we'll call QM, to represent the quantity that a monopolist would charge. But remember that they're not going to charge that price, because they know that the consumers are going to be willing to pay PM for the first QM units. That because the demand curve captures willingness to pay, that this is the price that they can actually charge. And so when we compare the price that monopolists charge and the quantity they produce to what would be produced in a perfectly competitive market, where we would make that decision based off the intersection of the supply and demand curve, and we would have Q perfectly competitive and P perfectly competitive, we can see that a monopolist charges too much, that the monopolist price is higher than the perfectly competitive price, and they produce too little. And so hopefully by now you've developed your Econ 101 supply and demand X-ray goggles, and you can see that this area to the right of the monopolist quantity, to the left of the perfectly competitive quantity, and above the supply curve and under the demand curve, this is all going to be lost opportunities from trade. This is going to be deadweight loss. And this is how monopolists are inefficient, that they have an incentive to restrict their output, to produce too little at too high of a cost. And we can get rid of this deadweight loss or minimize it if we're able to effectively regulate these monopolies. Okay, so we're going to consider two different ways in which we can control and regulate monopolies. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can use price controls and interventions in the supply and demand framework as a way to achieve a more efficient outcome for society as a whole. In this video, on this image here, we're going to discuss how we can break up monopolies or prevent them from forming in the first place. And so the government and regulators of monopolies are going to be able to quantify the concentration within a particular industry. And they can do so with different measures, one of which is the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, also called the HHI. And when the value in this industry exceeds 1,500, that is indicative that a merger between two companies should not be allowed to happen. That the government would then have evidence to believe that this is going to lead to undue market power, which could lead to negative outcomes for the rest of society. I know there was one economist out at, I forget what school in California, but his vanity plate on his car was HHI 1500. So that is, I guess, just an example of how nerdy us economists can get. But in addition to preventing mergers from happening, we can be more forceful and we can find an existing company which acts as a monopoly and we can separate it. However, going through that process, busting up the trust, that was the antitrust regulation, may not have a permanent solution, may not have a permanent outcome. We can see that when Standard Oil was broken up into different companies in the early part of the 20th century, since that point in time, in addition to all these different ways in which it was broken up, a lot of those companies have since rejoined and remerged to the point where we now have not the same degree of market concentration, market power, but more than we did 50, 60 years ago. So maybe a more lasting solution is to have effective government regulation, and we will view that in the next video.